There we go. Okay, we're recording now. So as soon as I said we'll record, I see that Pam turned off her, muted herself. It's okay,
There
Pam.
we are. They're back.
It's okay, Pam. Just pulling your leg. And here comes Scott.
Yay.
Okay, Scott, I'm recording. Are you there? Are you there?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, I'm recording.
Okay. We'll just make sure and let everybody know.
Well, those of us who are on now already know.
Okay.
And some of us have wine.
Jim, you look like you've lost weight.
Good.
You look like you've lost some weight.
Just a hair. Hair cut off.
Sebastian's antics are getting to be really fun to follow as you post them on Facebook, Scott.
Whose?
Sebastian's. His various things that he
Oh.
posts that he has to say. Very, a lot of fun to follow.
It is indeed.
Doesn't like your dad jokes, huh?
At least not this morning. He was not in the mood.
Hmm.
Oh. Well, I think we should at least give another minute to see if anybody logs on. So,
Okay.
because there were a couple of people who said on Facebook they were going to join who aren't here. So.
John Else.
Jeannie, how are you?
I'm
Hi,
good.
John.
Thanks. Yourself?
Fine.
You look tired. Are you tired?
Haven't seen you in a while.
I know. I come to worship every Sunday. I love it. But I'm not ready to go in. I have to sing. And I'm terribly afraid that when I show up, I'm going to forget all the rules and hug somebody. So I'm just waiting a little longer.
It's easy to forget the last Sunday I went marching up into the sanctuary without my mask. And then Kathy McConnell and I were inches away from shaking hands before we both kind of realized, it's just.
It's just a reaction.
I mean, even after all these months, it's still hard to reprogram decades and decades of other programming.
I ran 3 or 4 errands yesterday, and I have it all, I kind of have my routine. I have my mask in my car, and I do and 3 out of the 4 places, I walked into the place before I remembered to put my mask on. It was like, after all these months, it's like, why did you see that? There was a wonderful, it was a Facebook page. I can't remember who sent it, but it has this just angry eagle who's walking away. He looks very patriotic. And the subtitle says, how we all feel when we forget to take our mask into the store, walking back to the car. Because that's what that was doing.
I don't know how many times I've turned around. Because even if I remember to leave one in various places, it gets worn and then thrown in the dirty closet,
Yeah. I wash mine.
Well, I'm going to go ahead and start, even if there's others that are coming on. John and Kathy, we're going to record this. A couple of people asked for it to be recorded, so.
Okay.
Okay. Well, how is everybody? Good to see people. Many of you I've seen in some form or fashion, online or in person. So thanks for joining us tonight. Maybe we'll have a few others that will be logging on. Oh, in fact, I'm going to remind my mother because I thought she was going to. Now that just a second.
Where's your mom?
My name is Mom.
Okay. Well, obviously, in the current moment, there is an increased interest in anti-racism work. Lots of people are reading all the bestseller lists right now are various books trying to help, particularly white people, become more anti-racist. And as we were kind of thinking about, church intersection with that, and of course we've done all sorts of things at different times over the years. I thought, well, maybe a good way for us to think about it is how might contemporary Black theology contribute to this discussion? What's a theological way of engaging in this discourse? So that seemed to be a little bit a good fit for us as a congregation. So as I was kind of put my head to that some over the last couple of months, there's Jordan. So as I put my head, kind of thought about how to do that over the last couple of months. How are you, Jordan? Good to see you. How's Wisconsin?
We were having a little bit of like kids tablet crisis, so sorry that I was running late.
We're all aware. I had no internet earlier today, so fortunately that seems to have solved itself. So knock on wood, I should. So as I was thinking about how to do that, I've narrowed it down to the idea of we'll have 3 sessions. So today, part 1, I'll do a couple of what are now considered classic authors who set the course for contemporary Black theology, although both have written within the last 50 years, but have helped lay the groundwork for contemporary discourse. Part 2, I'll cover 2 recent discussions of how racism is deeply embedded in modern Christian theology and what Christian theology needs to do to try to fix that. And then in 2 weeks for part 3, 2 recent works of womanist theologians. And womanist theology we'll talk some more about today, but that's African American female theology, and it's its own distinct school. A couple of recent womanist theologians who have some ideas for how to have a more just church in society. So that will be the next. This will be this 3-week class. So when I talk about contemporary Black theology, I mean the movements that have emerged after Martin Luther King Jr. So influenced more by the Black Power movement, developments in Latin American theology, feminism, other movements that emerged in the late 60s and the 1970s. Now, of course, you don't want to think that there was no Black theology before that point. It, in fact, has a very long history. And if you're at all interested in kind of the long history of Black theology, there is a 2-volume work that historian of theology Gary Dorian has done. This is volume 1. Volume 1 was The New Abolition, kind of detailing the history of the Black social gospel theology, which isn't even the only form of Black theology, but one of the major strands of Black theological discourse going back into the 19th century. So, there is a long history of Black theology to draw from. And so I thought first as an intro is to get to sample a few of the much earlier thinkers who have stressed some of the themes that more contemporary thinkers have focused on. Hi, Mom. So, one example is Henry McNeil Turner, who was an African American AME, African Methodist Episcopal AME minister in the 19th century, And in 1895, he published the idea that God is a Negro, that Black people do not worship a white God and should not worship a white God, that they should reject the God of their white oppressors and understand that in order to understand God from the Black experience, we should think of God as also Black, which is a theme that we'll hit on in more contemporary thought. But it was interesting to me to discover that that wasn't an idea from the 1960s. That was an idea from the 1890s. W.E.B. Du Bois himself, who is pictured on the cover of the book, though a sociologist and not a theologian, a sociologist and not a theologian, still did some theological work. And in 1906, in response to some lynching and some police brutality, he published A Litany of Atlanta. And this is an excerpt from it, not the whole thing. Surely thou too art not white, O Lord, a pale, bloodless, heartless thing. Forgive the thought. Forgive these wild, blasphemous words. Thou art still the God of our Black fathers, and in thy soul's soul sit some soft darkenings of the evening, some shadowings of the velvet night. Pretty good poetry there. Another early person to highlight is that there were also African-American women theologians and religious thinkers, and one who I didn't really know anything about before I had read this book of Gary Dorian's was Nanny H. Burroughs. And she was a leader in some of the women's movements in the Black church in the early 20th century. And you know, in the Black church, women are very prominent in leadership, and that culture can often be have a strong matriarchal aspect. And so she was kind of the head of the women's organization for some of the denominations. And this is from something that she wrote in 1927. Preachers, teachers, leaders, welfare workers ought to address themselves to the supreme task of teaching the entire race to glorify what it has. Its face, its color, its place, its homes and communities, its grace, its spiritual endowment. So in some ways, in this 1920s church woman, you get some of the themes that will later be emphasized in the Black Power movement. She felt that working class Black women were morally superior to pretty much everyone else in American culture. She emphasized things like natural hair and natural color, which are very contemporary movements, but you know, so she was an interesting figure to discover. One more early person to highlight is George Washington Woodbey, who was from Omaha, Nebraska. He ran for lieutenant governor in 1896, obviously didn't win. He was a critic of capitalism, which will also become a theme in later Black theology, and argued that the Bible, it stands on the side of the poor. Here is a the Bible, in every line of it, is with the poor as against their oppressors. A direct quote. So again, that's something we usually associate with more late 1960s Latin American thought, but here is a Nebraskan in 1896, arguing that point. And I don't know much at all. I remember when I read about him, and also in this book, I tried to Google to find out more about Omaha's 19th century Black theologian, but don't know much about it. So those are there are many other people, but those are just kind of a few things I wanted to highlight. Let me pause there. Any thoughts or responses to any of that kind of early Black theology? Earlier. Okay. Well, of course, then in the middle of the 20th century, there was Martin Luther King and his entire cohort, prominent religious leaders in the civil rights movement, the group of just a generation older of politicians and professors and theologians who had helped to influence him. And then, of course, some of the younger people in his time period who eventually became critics of Dr. King and wanted the movement to move in other places. But my assumption is that we all are a little more familiar with that story and aspects of that tradition than we might be the earlier or the more recent. And so I didn't really want to focus there. I wanted to focus on more kind of contemporary Black theology. And so to do that today, then I want to introduce then two key figures who helped to lay the groundwork for that discussion. And the first is James Cone, who lived from 1938 to 2018. You might remember when he died, I talked about him in worship and he wrote a column about him and stuff. And, James Cone grew up in Bearden, Arkansas in the AME tradition, but spent a long time in his career as a professor at Union Theological Seminary. And when he first went there, he was kind of, the young new radical, but he stayed at Union so long that he was, the old sage by the time he died. His funeral was broadcast. It was from Riverside Church. It was so interesting to think of this kid that had grown up in, or this person who had grown up as a kid in the rural Black church, and now his funeral was this televised thing in this the grand Protestant cathedral in New York City, with all the leading lights of Protestant theology making their appearances. In 1969, Dr. Cone published a book, Black Theology and Black Power, in which he introduced the idea of Black liberation theology. And so in essence, he is the creator of that whole discipline. Now, he's not alone. There were a few other people also working similarly that had similar sorts of ideas, but Cone kind of understood as the founding father and then the leading figure of Black liberation theology for the last 50 years. And Black liberation theology shares some of the things with Black Power about emphasizing the importance of the Black experience and that it needed to be understood as different from the white experience, and being critical of white theology. And so, so one aspect of it is that it is critical of white Christianity, and partly is exposing kind of mainstream theology as being white Christianity and not just Christianity without an adjective to describe it. That it is in fact this kind of Eurocentric tradition. And part of his pointing out is that theological tradition doesn't understand itself in that way, and that is part of its problem. So the inheritors of Luther and Calvin and then Schleiermacher and Barth and all the great, that they are really speaking from a very particular vantage point that does not represent Christianity worldwide or in all expressions or all experiences. And yet that all of those great figures in theology are just as much ethnic theologians as an African American writing, but they don't understand themselves to be in that way. Also critical of white Christianity for its failure to confront racial issues and its own complicity in those racial issues. So one of the targets of Cone's work at various times in his career was Reinhold Niebuhr, Niebuhr, of course, had been the leading American theologian of the 20th century, public intellectual, known and read by plenty of people who weren't in theology and weren't just Christians. And Niebuhr had been an influence upon Cone, as well as Niebuhr influenced anyone from that time period who had been a Christian theologian and professor. And Niebuhr's also an interesting choice because Niebuhr would seem to be a theologian who you would judge as having done better than most on these sorts of it. He was concerned about poverty. He was, a liberal intellectual. He was concerned about race and trying to create a more just society. But Cone is critical of Niebuhr for a number of things. One, Niebuhr never really draws adequate attention to lynching, nor does he seem to identify the connection between lynching and the crucifixion of Christ. And Cone really points that out as like that this shouldn't have been a difficult step to take for someone of the intellect of Reinhold Niebuhr, and that he didn't take it, that he didn't understand it and grasp it, shows his limitations. The other thing that Niebuhr that Cone points out about Niebuhr is that Niebuhr, in his published works, does not cite or dialogue with African American thinkers. I mean, if you just look at his bibliographies and his footnotes, he does nothing to engage with or elevate published works of other African American theologians. Niebuhr would have known some of them, known them personally. He would have interacted with them in academic circles, but he in no way engages in his voluminous published works with Black thinkers. And which is a pretty damning sort of statement. One, because it just shows just completely shutting off from a certain sort of dialogue and discourse, and a failure to see any responsibility to try to elevate and give voice to people that from his position of privilege and power he could have done so. So Black liberation theology has this whole aspect of critical of white theology, while at the same time using the Black religious experience to discuss Christianity and to understand Christianity primarily then through the experience of African American people. So I want to read a really good excerpt from his book, God of the Oppressed, which I'll focus on, in which he kind of discusses the Black religious experience. And this will be a little bit of a long excerpt, but to me, this is kind of one of those places that's some of the heart of the book, and kind of getting what he's doing as far as method. So, the most visible symbol of death's power was found in the everyday experience of white people who violated Black dignity at every level of Black existence. Black people had to deal with the reality of whites on the job, in the stores, and at other significant areas of human affirmation. Sometimes the people were passive and speechless, not knowing how to respond to the extreme contradictions of life. But on Sunday morning, after spending 6 days of struggling to create meaning out of life, the people of Bearden would go to church because they believed that Jesus was going to be there with an answer for their troubled minds. At Macedonia AME Church, Sister Ora Wallace would line a familiar hymn, investing a depth of passion and meaning far greater than Isaac Watts ever intended. O God, our help in ages past, our hope for years to come, our shelter from the stormy blast, and our eternal home. Beneath the shadow of thy throne, thy saints have dwelt secure. Sufficient is thine arm alone, and our defense is sure. Immediately, the entire congregation would join her in the singing of this hymn because they felt the presence of Jesus in their midst, guiding their feet and holding their hands while they run this race. When the pastor would say, I know the Lord is in this place, can I get a witness? The people responded with shouts of praise, saying Amen and Hallelujah. Through song, prayer, and sermon, the community affirmed Jesus' presence and their willingness to try to make it through their troubled situation. Some would smile and others would cry. Another person, depending upon the Spirit's effect upon him, would clap his hands and tap his feet. Then again, another person would get down on her knees, waving her hands and moaning the melody of a song whose rhythm and words spoke to what she felt in her heart. All of these expressions were nothing but Black people bearing witness to Jesus' presence among them. He was the divine power in their lives who gave them an imagination to think of a good reason to keep on keeping on in order that Black people might make the best of a bad situation. Just always found that description incredibly compelling. Any comments there before I? And Sister Ora Wallace's name is stuck in my head. So this comes from the book God of the Oppressed, published in 1975, and in many ways his masterwork. So let me summarize some of the points. And if you read the excerpt that I posted online, you didn't have to, but some of you might have. We'll get into the details of it in a minute, but let me kind of summarize overall what he does in the book. He first argues for the validity of Black experience as itself a source of theology. He argues that the Bible should be read as addressing its own social context, that the Bible is not ignorant of the political and economic and social issues of its times, which means that the Bible should also then speak to the social contexts of our times. He argues that liberation is one of the key themes in Scripture. We've gotten pretty used to that idea, but when he's making that argument in the 60s and the 70s, and others like the Latin American theologians Gustavo Gutierrez and others were making the same argument in the Catholic tradition, and that was new. And to me, that's still like kind of the, one of the radical shifts in Christian theology that occurred, just as I was born or as a little kid. But then I've spent my career in the period that we now understand that liberation is a key theme of the Scripture, but that's still a relatively new idea in the history of Christian theology. He then, in the center of the book, and this is what we'll kind of come back to, is he poses this question, who is Jesus for us today? And in some ways, that's not, he's borrowing that question in an interesting way, because that's kind of the question that the 19th century German liberals posed. Who is Jesus for us today? It's kind of the question that like Albert Schweitzer poses at the end of the quest of the historical Jesus, that in each age and each time, a beautiful passage at the end of that book, that for each generation we kind of meet Jesus anew. So in some ways, Cone is picking up on the old liberal question, but he's going to do new things with it, and so we'll come back to that. Then after that, kind of the center of the book, then he argues about what liberation might actually mean in the context of the African American experience in America, in America in the 1970s. And then towards the end of the book, chapters on the role of suffering and our theological understanding, and then whether any sort of reconciliation with white people is possible, and if so, what that might look like. So in that center section, when he's posing this question, who is Jesus for us today? His answer is that Jesus is black. And that was kind of the, if you could other than the idea of liberation, kind of the other main idea of James Cone's life's work is this idea that we should understand Jesus as black. And so that's the section that I excerpted and posted on the website if anyone looked at that. So first, just kind of any responses to just that idea. What's kind of people's initial thought?
But did he mean to say that for everyone Jesus was black, or that the black community should view Jesus as black?
The first.
Hmm.
And I'll explain what he meant by that, in more critical detail.
Well, I thought he was a good logician.
Good what?
Logician.
Yeah.
I thought that the argument was really well made, that Jesus represented commitment to poverty and the poor and the alienated, and in the U.S. society that is the black folks. And so to say he's black is simply to say that's who he is.
I thought so too.
Well, your obviously first response is probably like, well, wait, but Jesus was Jewish, so, which we understand is not necessarily white, definitely not, European in the way we would understand it, definitely not Anglo-Saxon, blonde with blue eyes, Max von Sydow, cast in the film. But the direct quote from Cone is that Jesus is black because he was a Jew. And next week, when we get to the two thinkers we'll look at next week, they will both also really emphasize that it is central to black theology to actually reconnect the particularity of Jesus's Jewishness. And so that idea that Cone just kind of is very important to Cone, but gets developed even in more robust ways by the generation of theologians who come after that. And so part of the point he's making there is that, the Jews in their context are the oppressed, the occupied,
Yes.
the excluded. And so the point being that the incarnation doesn't occur, in a Roman centurion. It doesn't occur in the emperor. It doesn't occur in the person with power and privilege. That God consciously chose to be present in the excluded and the disenfranchised.
Yes.
And tied to this, so part of what he is critical of is that kind of mainstream European theology, European American theology, has viewed itself as universal. And he's trying to emphasize that it is itself also particular and maybe expressing universal themes. But that in a way it has gotten away from the particularity of Jesus's social context and the particularity of his cultural and ethnic identity. And if you better emphasize the particularity of Jesus, from that you actually get new universal themes that can then be applied in other particular contexts. And I think that that kind of step, that method has been transformative in biblical studies and in theology, because it's really after this time period, and of course also, post-Holocaust aspects play roles in this too. The biblical studies really began to get back into emphasizing the particularity of Jesus's Jewishness and understanding Jesus as a Jewish thinker and Paul as a Jewish thinker, and really have just transformed the interpretation of a lot of the New Testament in really even just the last 30 or 40 years. And then theologians have also gotten much better about how to take universal ideas and apply them in all sorts of particular contexts. So now you can read theologians, of every kind of identifying stripe, who go to a great deal of trouble, usually in the preface or the introduction, to explain their particularity, their particular point of view, and then how they're going to apply, these universal doctrines to their context. So, I've got ones as specific as, writing as a Korean immigrant woman. What is theology uniquely from that point of view? I mean, and so we now get this pluralistic chorus of voices from all sorts of different identifying factors, which has ended up making, it makes recent theology, there's no one kind of like dominant school or there's no Reinhold Niebuhr anymore, right? There's no like one dominating American theologian, but there's this rich plurality of voices who one has to keep in constant kind of conversation with, and then learn to own one's own particular place, and understand that that you're coming from your own, limited point of view. So in this section of Jesus is Black, he spends a good deal of time on the idea of the cross and the resurrection. And the cross being Jesus's solidarity with victims of oppression, and the resurrection representing the liberation from that, the overcoming of it. And some ideas here that are just kind of in nexus that get developed more in his later work. His late in life theological masterpiece is a book called The Cross and the Lynching Tree that Deb and Nikki and I in our theology brunch discussed. That was the very first book we did. We did it years ago. But his kind of late in life, fuller exploration of his view of the resurrection or of the crucifixion and tying that with the Black lynching experience. A marvelous book. In fact, that's if you were wanting to read any James Cone, that would actually be the one I recommend starting with. It's not as dense and it's a little shorter, but provocative and engaging and fascinating.
What's the title?
The Cross and the Lynching Tree. But then where the Jesus is Black section really gets to is that we must understand God as the one with the oppressed, that God is the one who is always present with whoever is experiencing oppression. And he argues that means God takes color seriously, because there also is this tendency, particularly in white European theology, to maybe argue that we should be colorblind, that race and ethnicity and those things shouldn't matter, that and emphasize human commonality. And Cone is one of those people who begins to that actually is not helpful. That whitewashes everything, because to be colorblind is to try to then see everyone through the lens of the white experience, rather than see the multitude of different perspectives. And he said, so if God is going to be with the oppressed, that means in 1975 America, and I don't think 2020 America is going to be radically different at this point, God is going to take color seriously, because people of color are the ones who are experiencing oppression.
What does that mean, Scott, that he's going to take it? Does that mean that people who are well-to-do and in power positions no longer can be a Christian? I don't understand what that means.
Well, it partly means it can't be ignored, that color can't be ignored. And if
he's on the side of those
there
people.
will be people who will make the point you were just saying, that it's, but I mean, even Jesus says it's hard for a rich man to get into the kingdom of heaven. I mean, there is that aspect of our tradition that this does push us into uncomfortable places, right? So if God, the Latin American theologians talk about God having a preferential option for the poor. Many of us like this idea of justice being, blind, and that none of us is any better than anyone else, which is an important part of Christian theology. But the Latin American theologians will say, well, yeah, God loves us all equally, but God actually loves the poor better, more than the rest of us. And so James Cone seems to, be making the argument that at least in 1975 America, God is with Black people more than he is with white people in power, because that's where God needs to be, and that's who God is. So.
Right.
When Luke talks about this, he says something like, the rich won't go to heaven because they had their consolations on earth. And maybe it's not that he has a preference for them, it's that they have a need for him.
That part of it is the need for him, yeah.
I'm thinking about the preferential for the poor, and what Nikki said about rich people, then can't be Christians, something like that. What I'm hearing in the conversation is that we identify poor with the economic piece of it. And it just makes me I don't have an answer, but it just I hear a question in there about, but those rich people and those who oppress others and those who don't know God or choose to embrace the way of God are spiritually oppressed. And where is God in that? And that doesn't exclude any color necessarily, but I hear the preferential part when it comes to our more colorful friends, I define more by economics and oppression that are related to it. I mean, it goes together, I get that, but it's awkward.
And part of it is the tradition had long emphasized God wiping away our sins, which is something that in many ways speaks more to the oppressor, right? A way to be forgiven for what you've done wrong. And in the last 50 years, there's been a much more of an emphasis about, well, salvation does include that. It also includes God righting the wrong. So, some people are not so much the sinners as the sinned upon, the victims, the sinned against, and salvation for them can't just be your sins are forgiven. Salvation for them has to be that the injustice has to stop and the wrong has to be righted.
Yep.
And so so much more contemporary theologians kind of understand salvation is in this two-pronged way that you don't find very little discussion in the whole history of Christian theology about understanding it as this two-pronged aspect. So, Cohn says that if Christ is not black in America in the 1970s, then Jesus lied, because Jesus came to preach good news to the poor and to set captivity captive and to free the slaves. That's what Jesus said he was coming to do. And in 1975, that's who it is. And if Jesus isn't doing that, then the gospel isn't true.
Is this, I'm thinking, if I was Hispanic, would I say, well, my God has to be Hispanic. He can't
exactly.
be.
Yeah. Yeah. You will say, yeah, they in fact, they will say that. Yeah. But go look, next time you're in my office, but notice, of course, that I have no white representations of Jesus. The Jesuses in my office are they are black and brown and Asian. And it is that way on purpose. So
Interesting.
But no females, huh?
That's a fair point, Dan. I think the female religious experience is highlighted in some of the art, but the one that's behind my desk is not explicitly a Christ image, but it is a woman but with her arms out in that kind of typical Christ image. So maybe that is you could interpret it that way. So fair criticism. So I do on occasion get comment about the black queer Jesus with an afro that hangs it prominently in the center. It doesn't get nearly as much comment as I intend for it to do.
Well, I was thinking, is there somebody who makes the argument that God is gay?
Yeah, of course. Yeah. I mean that's part of the point. Cohn begins a form of discourse that then lots of people have interpreted, and so the idea is how to understand that as a symbol and as a metaphor, but but not let it be only that there is that there is something of substance being said here. So let me read kind of his closing part of that section. My point is that God came and continues to come to those who are poor and helpless for the purpose of setting them free. And since the people of color are his elected poor in America, any interpretation of God that ignores black oppression cannot be Christian theology. The blackness of Christ, therefore, is not simply a statement about skin color, but rather the transcendent affirmation that God has not ever left the oppressed alone in struggle. He was with them in Pharaoh's Egypt, is with them in America, Africa, and Latin America, and will come in the end of time to consummate fully their human freedom. I think that summarizes the point, trying to make.
Well, and too, you can argue, Nikki, that just because you're rich doesn't mean you're not oppressed. If you look at
That's
the
true.
roles that women have played, especially in rich cultures.
Yeah. Yes. Well, it sort of makes me think maybe we all need to think of Christ as maybe we're all inventing him in our image, like the other way around.
Yeah.
So there's two things. One is yes, and we should. I mean, like that. There's something of value there. Yes, but I think that Cohn's saying more than that. But some images are closer to the intentions of the gospel than other, and that some images might actually do some harm to other people.
The problematic part is that if we invent him in our own image and we ourselves are privileged, then there's a problem. So those of us who basically are in a privileged situation have a different kind of challenge in imaging Jesus than those people who are the oppressed.
So I mean, because contemporary American evangelicals clearly envision Jesus in their own image
Yes.
as a white, middle-class, suburban Republican. And, so, and yes, they have the freedom to do that, but they are doing that uncritically and not in discourse with others, and in ways that image then becomes harmful to other people.
Yeah, and it becomes harmful to themselves as well, because they are oppressed by that thinking and don't even know that they're oppressed by that thinking, that they need liberating. And that I think what Kathy said earlier, and the part that you read really resonated with me. And before you started reading, what I was hearing from the conversation was that God sees me, and to be able to image God in your color, to hear that is important, but that oppression is not always a matter of economics or politics, for that matter.
Well, and when people, at least from me and people I know, when you think about Jesus, is mostly when you're scared, when you're either sick, or I don't know if that's really true, but that's true in people I know. And they can be rich or poor or whatever, and they can still be depressed and ridden with anxiety and all those kind of things. And so that's when then for me, I find myself going back to my childhood Jesus, and I think of Daniel and the lion's den and all that kind of stuff, because that's where my real strong Jesus training came, was back then, but it's not the same as when I'm thinking in my head.
So when I was last a youth minister, more than 15 years ago, and I was teaching this idea to my youth group, like they got it immediately. They didn't need a lot of, and so I posed Code's question, who is Jesus Christ for us today? And one of my smart young kids said, a disabled lesbian living in the barrios of Buenos Aires. And I was like, yeah, okay, you got that point. So we'll do. So let's move on. So we do. So the other kind of groundbreaking person who helps to set the discourse for terms of contemporary discourse is Dolores Williams, she's still living, born 1937, and also at Union Theological Seminary. And she is kind of the founding mother of Womanist theology. So womanism is a term that was originally coined by Alice Walker, not in the context of theology. Williams was the first to apply it in theology. Alice Walker, of course, the novelist, author of The Color Purple, among other things. And Alice Walker coined the term because she believed that white feminism did not take Black female experience seriously. Neither did Black liberation thought, both in its theological and non-theological forms, take the experience of Black women seriously. And so, one of the sins of the civil rights movement is how patriarchal and misogynist some of those key leaders were. How often they kind of exploited the labor and the work of the women in the movement without giving them full voice and leadership. And there's a lot, that you can read a lot of that from people like Diane Nash and others who were, and Fannie Lou Hamer and others who are just as significant in the leadership of the movement. So then in the kind of the younger group in the next generation was like, they were going to make sure that didn't continue to happen. And the Womanists were very critical of James Cone for not taking the experience of Black women seriously. And to his credit, James Cone took the criticism, understood the criticism, and adapted and changed his thought. And his later work does not speak only, kind of male experience and in gendered. Because you notice the excerpt I read, we used gendered language, but he quit that. And he not only, adapted his thought, he also took multiple opportunities to elevate the role of women. So Dolores Williams ends up as a professor of theology at the same seminary, and Cone has been one of his great roles was making sure that the next generation or two of theologians that he helped to train and educate were included not just men but women, and so one of the women we'll look at on the final week is one of Cone's most prominent students. So her major work isn't published until 1993, though in essays and other things this had been going on for a while, and it's called Sisters in the Wilderness, The Challenge of Womanist God Talk. And she, again, was not the only one. There were others, Katie Cannon and others who were, but Dolores Williams kind of becomes the central figure. And so she argues that, womanist thought is really focused on challenging all forms of oppression. Womanist theology challenges all oppressive forces impeding Black women's struggle for survival and for the development of a positive, productive quality of life conducive to women's and the family's freedom and well-being. Womanist theology opposes all oppression based on race, sex, class, sexual preference, physical disability, and caste. So it wasn't focused only on race, it wasn't focused only on gender, but it was really in this sort of discourse that this concept of intersectionality appears. That term, now I'm blanking on the woman who came up with that term in the late 80s, but it was largely Black female thinkers who were the ones that were really emphasizing the intersectionality of class, race, gender. Kimberly Crenshaw, thanks, Jordan, who were emphasizing that all of these have to be dealt with together as a set of issues, that you can't just deal with one or the other. The excerpt that I put on the website was from her introduction. And so in that introduction, she first reveals that there is within Black Christianity a second tradition that often has been overlooked, which is a female-centered tradition. And so the kind of published theological works and the ones that were known to the level that they were largely the men from the 19th and the 20th centuries, but that there is a strong female-centered Black Christian tradition. And so part of womanist work with feminist work is recovering voices and stories and figures and that have been ignored. And she identified in her early work that a key aspect of that female-centered tradition was a real focus and elevation on the story of Hagar, the concubine, the handmaiden of Sarah and concubine of Abraham. That from at least the 19th century on, Black women in America identified with the character of Hagar, and that had been dominant in their thinking and their writing and their songs and their storytelling. And I just preached on Hagar a few months ago, and I spent almost the whole sermon unpacking, Dolores Williams. And so I read this already in that sermon, but I'll read it again. Hagar's predicament involves slavery, poverty, ethnicity, sexual and economic exploitation, surrogacy, rape, domestic violence, homelessness, motherhood, single parenting, and radical encounters with God. Her point being, And all of those are the Black female experience in the United States. And then what the womanists emphasize is that liberation is important, but it's not the only thing. And in fact, it's not all that central to Black women's experience. That central to the Black female experience is, first of all, just survival. And that theology and the religious experience has to first just give you the tools to survive. That often the most important form of resistance you can do is simply to live through a difficult circumstance. And liberation, of course, is a dream and a hope, but you first have to have survival. And then also an emphasis upon quality of life. And what kind of life are you being liberated to? You don't really want to just survive. You want to have as good a life as you possibly can. And so the female tradition has never emphasized liberation quite the way the male tradition has, but has emphasized what are the tools necessary in order to survive and live well in the circumstances. And it's a communal approach. As is often the case with female thinkers, much more emphasis upon you don't just get this alone, that you get this as a family, as a neighborhood, as a community unit, as a network, that you work on it together and help each other. So, and then in the rest of the intro is one of those intros that kind of summarizes where she's going to go in the book. So that's why I printed that out. So she begins with a very detailed interpretation of the Hagar story and how that connects to Black female experience, and with a bunch of chapters that then deal with some of those themes. A chapter on slavery, a chapter on motherhood, on surrogacy, on color and color prejudice, on survival and resistance in the wilderness. So a lot connecting to that wilderness experience. Let's see. Contrary to Anglo-American ideals about true womanhood, this African-American notion affirms such qualities as defiance, risk-taking, independence, endurance when endurance gives no promise, the stamina to hold things together for the family, even without the help of a spouse, the ability and poverty to make a way out of no way, the courage to initiate political action in the public arena, and a close personal relationship with God.
All very strong traits.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Now,
And I do think feminism has itself over time learned more from the experiences of women of color, and hopefully more listens to them more than they may. But that was obviously one of the big struggles of the early 70s and the women's movement. So
it was.
Question. The idea of surrogacy were they referring to the way that many Black women raised white children?
partly, yeah, that's one of the aspects, yeah.
But also that the Black women were made to be either raped by or, like in Abraham's case, had to be the substitute wife of Abraham to provide a child.
Yeah, both of those examples, kind of the rape form of surrogacy, you're going to have a child forming with you, and then the other that, the Black woman is mammy, who often was more of a mother to the white child than the white mother, and forced to do that, and to the expense of their own children, which didn't end. If you watched the TV miniseries Mrs. America, there's there's even a little bit of that dynamic at one point of the black cook wanting to leave to go take care of her own kids, but and this is just in an employee situation, but even there, the sense of not understanding this other woman as a woman and a mother and her own obligations. So,
but also in terms of just the extended family, like so many students that, one parent's incarcerated and the family kicks in. I've talked with more aunties and grandmothers than I probably have parents of many of my students. And that's kind of an internal form of surrogacy, I think, that also it's talk about intersectionality with the concept of the whole community.
Yeah, that's an important thing to point out. And then also that other kind of, raising not just their own children, but their grandchildren and their nieces and their nephews and other,
Yeah, even other people's kids.
And it's not, and how, and family terms get applied in ways different than bloodline, and more relational. Then there's a whole section of her book about how her method dialogues with others. So how it dialogues with and critiques Black liberation theology, white feminism, and then in particular the Black church. Because she's very clear that while many Black women have found solace and comfort and religious experience in the Black church can be exploitative of Black women. It's a patriarchal power structure. Black ministers can often be sexual predators, and she goes into all of this, in her chapters. One of the key aspects of that became its own kind of prominent development from her work is that she rejects the kind of Black liberation theology's view of suffering and the atonement, in that Cone and the other Black liberation theologians very much emphasize this idea of our salvation comes through, Jesus is identifying being present with us in our suffering. And as many, and even white, feminist theologians critical of those ideas, that suffering just can't be viewed as redemptive in any way, shape, or form, that whole notion is obnoxious, that suffering has to be alleviated and done away with, and that so she and other womanist thinkers are critical of those notions of salvation, and instead that salvation then becomes something about relationships. And on our third day, we'll really dial in on more contemporary aspects of this, but a couple of things. It seems more intelligent and more scriptural to understand that redemption had to do with God through Jesus giving humankind new vision to see the resources for positive, abundant relational life. So, not about removing the stain of sin or defending God's honor or something like that. I guess that had to go to choir. I was trying to rush to get done before 7, but and then that's the resurrection of Jesus and the kingdom of God theme in Jesus's ministerial vision provide Black women with the knowledge that God has, through Jesus, shown humankind how to live peacefully, productively, and abundantly in relationship. So salvation is not this otherworldly thing. Salvation is about giving the tools for survival, quality of life, resilience right now, for people in need and for their families. And so at the conclusion of the book, she discusses survival strategies, and she gives 4 that she's identified in the Black female religious experience: the art of cunning, the art of encounter, the art of care, and the art of connecting. The art of cunning she describes as a wholesome shrewdness to assure the survival of the person in the family. So learning to do what it takes in order to make sure you and your family survives. And in conditions of slavery and Jim and Jane Crow and mass incarceration, that can mean, all sorts of things, but learning how to be cunning and shrewd in those environments. An art of encounter, she says, has two aspects, both resistance and endurance, and knowing how much of which to do in which situations and at what times and places. So there will be times that one just endures the indignity and the oppression, and there are times when one actively resists it. And that part of Black women's wisdom is knowing in any given moment which of those to apply and at what level. And then an art of care, that is this whole idea of how you care for all the kids and all the family and all the, and I think a lot of Darrell Goodwin, who's our associate conference minister, who's now going to move on to New England, and he talks about a whole bunch about, his grandmother, and she always wants to make food for everybody, and have large groups. There very much is that sense of, even when you don't have a lot yourself, you still are having to care for everybody else. And then that art of connecting, of building relationships, of making networks and communities, and of kind of understanding who you need on your team in order to do this work. And then I wanted to read her final paragraph. So, the greatest truth of Black women's survival and quality of life struggle is that they have worked without hesitation and with all the energy they could muster. Many of them, like Hagar, have demonstrated great courage as they resisted oppression and as they went into the wide, wide world to make a living for themselves and their children. They depended upon their strength and upon each other. But in the final analysis, the message is clear. They trusted the end to God. Every important event in the stories of Hagar and Black women turns on this trust. Thoughts or comments or questions?
Good stuff.
Looks like John has something.
Yeah, this isn't about the last paragraph that you just read, but it's on page 4 in what you shared with us.
Yeah.
And it's in the second paragraph towards the bottom.
Okay.
Two statements that she makes that for me seemed like contradictory. And so I'm just wondering your impression. It's down towards the bottom where it says, God provided Hagar with a resource. God gave her new vision to see survival resources where she had seen none before. Liberation in the Hagar stories is not given by God. It finds its source in human initiative. So I was questioning, like, how is that not provided by God, in your opinion? Like how it's cyclical, it's circular. I don't know.
Yeah, I think what that means is that, so the liberation motif, and I should have pointed this out discussing, the liberation motif is so dramatically tied to the Exodus experience, right? So these dramatic acts of God to, the 10 plagues and the drowning of the army in the Red Sea, and, these, but Hagar didn't get any of that. Like, God doesn't miraculously deliver her from the wilderness. God gives her some water, make sure that she survives, gives her some advice of here's what you need to do. But at least the stories we get in Genesis is beyond that she makes a name for herself and a people for herself, and all that seems to be something she does. It doesn't seem to be something that, with some dramatic supernatural activity. That's how I take what she's saying there, is that it's not full-blown liberation like you get in the Exodus story, but it's here's the tools you need, and then she had to do it herself.
Yeah,
Does that answer your question?
Yeah, like when I read it, I was still thinking how both of those would be God-given, right? But I think what you're telling me, it's like not direct intervention. It's like a character type of intervention.
And I think her final paragraph does get to that, in sense, but she seems to be saying this is actually how God works more often. We don't get Exodus experiences. We get, so then what would be really interesting, and I've not read anyone, someone should then unpack the idea of Harriet Tubman as Moses, because it's not divine supernaturalness, but it's like figuring it out yourself and being the agent, of liberation. Because Harriet Tubman is not just a survival figure, that's a liberation figure. But
It seems so much like it's a matter of, do you just, pray, expect the work to be done for you? Or are we working with God? And you use this phrase sometimes, and I know I pray it a lot, as instruments of God's grace to move forward with God's vision for how we are to be and to live. I think of Habitat all the time. It's like, you don't just get your house. You put in that sweat equity. It's a with God and with one another. We live the life God calls us to live.
hey, John's been trying to get a word in. So.
Well, I have a number of experiences that have helped me understand women's roles. I was a member of a Black Baptist church in North Gulfport, Mississippi in 64, 65. And it was it was not a patriarchal organization, other than the pastor obviously was a man. But the church was really controlled by women. We came to Omaha and joined the Calvin Presbyterian Church, which was a Black church in North Omaha. That was more, a kind of a balance between men and women in the structure. Men played a more important role probably, and then I went to Africa and did an evaluation of a relief program in rural Zimbabwe. And it was interesting to see that whenever we had a meeting, the men always sat around the table and the women sat outside the table.
Okay.
No? And when I asked a question, the men wouldn't answer. They would turn to the women who were really responsible for doing the work. And the women would answer the question and give us the evaluation response that we needed. And it was just an unbelievable dynamic that I think is still present in the African-American church in the United States, the main denominations thing. But it's just an image of, and it's true in many parts of the South Sudanese community I'm working with now. The men really control the decisions, but the women play really important roles, and actually in many ways are the decision makers.
Is that an example of women using cunning to determine how they're going to exercise their influence?
Definitely so.
Or the wisdom of the men to know that women are at the heart of the community.
True, but I don't think that's a sustainable long-term
No,
solution.
not a very just arrangement. So, these two thinkers and others with them, but they're the leading lights. Kind of set the terms of discourse that have now shaped, the last 30 to 50 years of this dialogue. So, next week we're going to look at two theologians, both professors at Duke Divinity, who at the same year both published books analyzing how racist modern Christian theology was. And yet they have different perspectives that don't tell the exact same story in this exact same. But one of the interesting features, they both share the idea that like the particularity of Jesus' Jewishness is central to understanding that. And so it's also unmasking the anti-Semitism of modern Christian theology. So Christian theology is poisoned by white supremacy and racism, but then also how to fix it. It's not just critical, but it's how to fix that. So that will be the topic for next week. So, which gets more specifically then to this, like, how do we be anti-racist Christians in the year 2020? And then like I said, the final week will be then two more recent womanist thinkers kind of updating that dialogue for contemporary circumstances. And one of the features of those two, a commonality, will be that different from James Cone and Dolores Williams has been more recent generations being in touch more with the African religious experience and African theology, which is its own African American theology and African theology are not exactly the same thing, but African American theology has had much more discourse with African experience. And so one thing you'll encounter in the third week is those two womanist theologians drawing on aspects of African mythology and religious experience as a part of, which becomes interesting, as we kind of understand our theology and our church history and everything. We tell a very European story, but as our culture gets, more pluralistic and diverse, it will also behoove us to understand these other streams and the ways in which they will also inform, from here on out, our theological understanding. So we need to understand a little bit about Yoruba goddesses in order to, have some better understanding of our religious experience. So.
Good.
Okay. Well, thanks, guys. So I don't want to go too much longer. I need to go eat dinner, and I'm assuming some of you do too. So.
Very good. Good session. Thank you.
Everybody.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Yeah,
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
and Deb, I like your sweatshirt.
Thank you.
I don't know, do it.